Nel 541 d.C., l'impero romano d'Oriente sembra, almeno in superficie, vicino a una seconda giovinezza. Giustiniano I governa da Costantinopoli con un progetto enorme e quasi romantico per i suoi tempi: ricostruire l'unità del vecchio impero. Ha già riconquistato l'Africa ai Vandali, sta dissanguando uomini e denaro nella lunga guerra in Italia contro gli Ostrogoti, riforma le leggi con un'ambizione senza precedenti e trasforma la capitale in un manifesto di potenza, come dimostra la nuova Santa Sofia. Eppure, proprio mentre la macchina imperiale spinge al massimo, arriva un nemico che non ha eserciti, non ha confini, non negozia. Una pandemia che i contemporanei descrivono come un'ombra capace di attraversare il mondo conosciuto, cambiando per sempre demografia, economia e politica dell'Europa e del Mediterraneo. La chiameremo peste di Giustiniano, perché le fonti la collegano al suo regno e perché lo stesso imperatore, secondo la tradizione storica, si ammalò e sopravvisse. Ma in realtà questa non è una singola epidemia breve. È il primo grande ciclo pandemico di peste documentato in modo esteso nella storia eurasiatica e mediterranea, con ondate che ritornano per circa 2 secoli, fino a metà VIII secolo. Gli storici moderni parlano infatti di prima pandemia di peste, un'era di recrudescenze, diverse per intensità e geografia, che colpiscono a ripetizione porti, città, campagne e snodi commerciali. Dove inizia tutto? Le cronache concordano su un punto cruciale. L'esordio osservabile avviene in Egitto, nel 541, nell'area di Pelusio, vicino agli accessi del Delta e ai grandi corridoi di traffico tra Mediterraneo e Oriente. Da lì il contagio corre lungo le direttrici più moderne del tempo: le rotte dei cereali, i porti, i magazzini, le navi. L'Egitto è il granaio dell'impero. Rifornire Costantinopoli significa muovere tonnellate di grano e migliaia di uomini, animali, sacchi, corde, contenitori. È il tipo di sistema che crea ricchezza e che, senza saperlo, può diventare un acceleratore biologico perfetto. Nel 542 la peste raggiunge Costantinopoli e qui la storia cambia tono. Non stiamo più parlando di un caso ai margini dell'impero, ma del cuore amministrativo, militare e simbolico del Mediterraneo orientale. Le testimonianze più celebri sono quelle di Procopio di Cesarea, storico vicino agli ambienti del potere e osservatore diretto dell'evento nella capitale. Procopio descrive l'arrivo del morbo come inevitabile, quasi come una marea. La città sa che sta arrivando, eppure non ha strumenti per fermarlo. Quando esplode, la normalità collassa. I tribunali rallentano, i lavori si fermano, i quartieri diventano silenziosi e l'ossessione quotidiana diventa una sola: chi si ammalerà, chi morirà e come gestire i morti.
How does the disease appear to 6th century eyes? Sources speak of sudden fever, weakness, mental confusion, and above all, those painful swellings, buboes, that appear in places such as the groin, armpits, or neck. Many die within a few days. Some survive after brutal crises. Procopius also reports forms with delirium or deep lethargy. Other authors note that some people develop buboes but do not die, and that the disease seems to choose without any apparent logic, fueling panic and supernatural interpretations. In a world where medicine is a weave of practical observation, humoral theory, and faith, the event is also read as divine judgment, an apocalyptic trial, or a sign of cosmic disorder. Today we know with far greater certainty what that disease was: plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This is not a hypothesis based only on similar symptoms. Genetic studies on 6th century human remains have identified Yersinia pestis DNA in burials compatible with the pandemic era, confirming the pathogen and even allowing researchers to reconstruct ancient bacterial genomes. This is a decisive point because for centuries, people debated whether late antique descriptions truly indicated classic plague or some other disease. The answer, at least for many outbreaks, is that why? Pestis really was there. How is it transmitted? The most typical form is bubonic plague, often linked to fleas that feed on rodents, and then, under certain conditions, on humans as well. But Yersinia pestis can also appear in faster and more lethal forms: septicemic and pneumonic plague, the latter capable of spreading from person to person through respiratory droplets. This helps explain two elements in the sources: the speed with which some communities collapse and the variety of clinical pictures described. In an ancient urban ecosystem, grain warehouses, waste, animals, crowded housing, it takes very little for an outbreak to become explosive. In Constantinople, the problem is not only death, it is logistics. Corpses pile up. Families cannot perform funeral rites. There are not enough coffins, stretcher bearers, priests, or gravediggers. The living fear the dead, but they cannot ignore them. The smell, the risks, the collective trauma. Procopius tells of a city forced to invent emergency solutions: mass graves, hurried burials, buildings and spaces adapted to hold bodies while they wait. The very idea of urban order, what for the empire, is propaganda and identity breaks under biological pressure. In this scenario, Justinian's figure becomes paradoxical. He is the man who wants to put order into the Roman world with laws, armies, and great works, yet he faces a disaster that does not fit the categories of power. According to tradition, the emperor falls ill in 542 and survives. In the mindset of the time, this can be read as a sign of divine favor, or proof that the ruler is destined to complete his mission. But the survival of the leader does not save the system. The state machine loses taxpayers, soldiers, and officials. Fiscal revenues fall while military spending remains extremely high. The countryside is depopulated in some areas, and the agricultural cycle breaks down. The economic effects are those typical of a demographic and productive shock: labor shortages, disrupted trade, rising prices for certain goods, and crises in tax collection and inheritance succession. And mortality? Here we must be honest. We will never have precise numbers. Procopius speaks of thousands of deaths per day in Constantinople at the peak, with staggering figures, up to 10,000 a day in the formulas handed down. But modern historians debate how literal those estimates are, how rhetorical they are, and how much they come from reliable counting. We do know, however, that the impact was enormous, at least in certain cities and in certain waves, because otherwise we would not have such insistent chronicles, such extreme emergency measures, and archaeological and documentary traces compatible with a temporary collapse of normal practices. The key point is not to fix a perfect number, but to understand that for generations, the plague became a structural variable of Mediterranean life. And in fact, it does not end in 542. After the first wave, the plague returns. In some regions, it reappears years or decades later. In others, it seems to remain endemic for periods, likely sustained by animal reservoirs and by commercial networks that continue to function. Here, the Justinian plague stops being an episode and becomes an era, the first plague pandemic, with recurrences until around 750. This long duration changes how societies adapt. Markets realign, fiscal and military priorities shift. Some cities hold up better, others worse, and in many areas, uncertainty becomes chronic. The geography of disaster is Mediterranean and intercontinental. It strikes the Eastern Roman Empire, but also the neighboring Sasanian Empire. It passes through the Levant, Anatolia, and the Balkans. It reaches Italy at a moment already devastated by war. It appears in Gaul and, according to some reconstructions, even touches more northern and peripheral areas than the written sources explicitly attest. In recent years, the combination of archaeology and biomolecular analysis has been redrawing the map. In some cases, the bacterium is found even where texts do not explicitly mention epidemics, suggesting that the visibility of plague depended heavily on urban density, written culture, and whether someone had the interest or ability to record the event. There is also an environmental context that makes this period even more unsettling. The 6th and 7th centuries coincide with a prolonged cooling phase in the Northern Hemisphere, often called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, linked to a sequence of major volcanic eruptions, 536, 540, 547, and to complex climatic dynamics. A more unstable climate means more fragile harvests, more likely famines, migrations, and social tensions easier to trigger. It also means that balances between humans, animals, and parasites can shift. No one can say that climate caused the plague in a simple way, but the overlap of climatic shocks, food crises, and pandemic creates a multiplier effect. Societies already under stress become more vulnerable to a highly lethal pathogen. Now, the question in your title, "The Pandemic That Changed Europe," must be handled carefully, because here, a major historiographical debate comes into play. For a long time, especially in popular narratives, the Justinian plague was presented as a clean break, tens of millions dead, an economy on its knees, the end of antiquity, the beginning of the Middle Ages. In recent years, however, part of the research has questioned the idea of a uniform and total collapse, arguing that the impact was highly variable, that some estimates were inflated, and that the available data do not always support a continuous demographic apocalypse across the Mediterranean for 2 centuries. That said, even without turning it into a single, all-powerful cause, it is hard to deny that the pandemic altered balances. Justinian fights extremely costly wars. In Italy, the reconquest is long and grinding, and when plague removes men and resources, every campaign becomes heavier. On the eastern frontier, pressure from the Persians does not disappear because there is an epidemic in Constantinople. On the contrary, imperial competition continues while the fiscal base weakens. Meanwhile, in the Balkans and Danubian areas, pressures and migrations increase. Slavic populations and other groups move in a more unstable world, where cities and countryside may have been intermittently emptied, and where an empire engaged on multiple fronts can react with less margin. The plague does not explain everything, but it can be a force that lowers the threshold of resistance. It makes every soldier more expensive, every harvest more fragile, and every tax collection harder. Another often underestimated aspect is psychological and cultural. A returning pandemic changes the perception of time. On a scientific level, the Justinian plague is also a window into pathogen evolution. Ancient genomes indicate that the 6th century strain is not identical to that of the 14th century Black Death. It belongs to a different phase in the evolutionary history of Yersinia pestis. This means the plague is not a single event repeated the same way. It is a family of epidemics that change over time, with ecologies, vectors, and dynamics that may differ. And here's a fascinating point for the story. Human history and microbial history are intertwined. First, demography in many urban areas. Contracts, even if only temporarily, changing labor, wages, property, and social relationships. Second, the imperial state, already heavily taxed and engaged in wars and great projects, finds itself with less revenue and more disputes and must make harsh choices. Third, the Mediterranean network, the empire's strength also becomes a channel of biological vulnerability. Fourth, the perception of risk and the divine intensifies, and with it, the politicization of religion. Fifth, the cluster of crises, climate, wars, pandemic, makes the 6th to 7th centuries one of the most stressed periods of Western Eurasia, where small changes can produce major chain effects.